So, all the way over in New York, Serge Prengel, thank you so much for joining us.
Very happy to be with you, Richard.
Now, there's only half of me. I'm sorry, Matt's just got a few issues that came up unexpectedly. So I'm afraid you'll just have to put up with my questions. So all sensibility and reasonableness, which is what Matt represents, is out the window, and it'll just be you and me. We'll have a great time.
All right.
Now, it's because we brought you on because we heard about you to bring you on because of a new book, which is a reasonable thing, but you've been around for a while. So I want to talk about that. But the proactive 12 steps, this is mindfulness work. And if perhaps you could introduce us a little bit to the book and a bit of the journey that brought you up, because it's been around. I can see this as the 6th edition. So you've been working on this for some time. It's lovely. Our good friend Stephen Porges gave a lovely presentation of it. Some other lovely people in your reviews. So fill us in on the Serge story.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I discovered the proactive 12 steps through a friend a long time ago. I mean, not the proactive 12 steps, the 12 steps through a friend many, many, many years ago, I think 30 some years ago. I'm a therapist, and as a therapist, I really don't have a step program or something that's a direct way of leading people along a predetermined way. As therapists, we try to be very, very attuned to our clients and see their unique needs and help them. And so I was really intrigued about that way of thinking that had a list of steps for people to achieve personal growth, and not just personal growth in ordinary circumstances, but under the very drastic circumstances of being in the throes of addiction. I love the concept of self-help. And so I was intrigued by that, and I've had over the years a dialogue with it, and which led to different editions of the steps. So this one is a latest edition because it's really something that has been enhanced every time in terms of my experience, in terms of what I learned about the process of therapy, the process of personal growth, what I learned about clients, what I learned about myself. And so it's been incorporated into changing the wording of these steps. There's a sense of tremendous respect for the process that was created by the original steps, but also of wanting to tweak them and change them based on what is contemporary understanding of what human beings are and how they change, and especially understanding of trauma.
And so when you talk about the original steps, you're referring to the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps.
Yes.
Yeah, and this aspect of addiction that it's working with, and in particular there was alcoholism, but I'm sure those steps are used in other things as well, aren't they?
Are used in many forms of addiction. And by the way, the concept of the proactive 12 steps is not just for addiction, it's for anybody who wants to achieve change, because the beauty of the 12 steps was to say, you have a problem with, say, alcohol, but they really don't talk about alcohol. They talk about how to change your life. And so I like that concept, and I took that concept of step by step to adapt it to my understanding of how it is that we can actually make changes in the face of the mechanisms that prevent us from doing that.
Yeah, because I was going to say to you that having looked at through the book and looked at the 12 steps, there's nothing there that makes me assume that it's about addiction. And in fact, now we talk about the fact that reminding me that's some of the origins of where you work, that there's been so much talk in later recent years about that addiction is a connection problem, is a relationship problem. And by repairing the sense of relationship to self and to others, the product becomes, the addictive thing becomes less needed and desired. So I was actually, that was also why I felt I almost needed to ask the question, like, hey, this is so independent and has such a broad-ranging impact on the user. Gee whiz, did it really just come from that? So that was why, the AA stuff. Now, what you do is there's some beautiful things that ring in my ears so lovely. That therapy in itself is a created process. It's an evolving, improvised sort of process. But I very often said to people, Matt and I are both musicians as well, and we say, first you learn the scales before you learn to improvise. So steps are really valuable sometimes. And even now, I will utilize step processes and things in order to get myself get my feet on the ground, get myself settled. And then I imagine. So as you go, you're just saying changing the words and evolving this. Was this, how much was this sort of experientially driven? How much of it was sort of just personal contemplation and deliberate practice sort of driven? Perhaps they were equal, but what was the process there as you went through finding that there were just sort of better ways to word it, better ways to apply it?
So it's been in my mind, in the back of my mind for 30 some years. Obviously not all the time, but there's a constant dialogue going on in that sense about how do I understand this thing that so many millions of people have been doing in terms of how I relate to the clients I see and the way they make changes. How do I relate to it in terms of how I myself experience the difficulties of being in the moment and making changes? The same way that as an experiential therapist, I have a constant dialogue between what I do with my clients, how I am with them, the kind of space I provide with them, the struggles I see them go through, and my own. I think that's something that you will probably agree with me, that I am that much more useful as a therapist to my clients if I myself am in the middle of a creative process.
Yes, absolutely agree. Yeah.
That being in the presence of what's happening and being very attached to also comparing it and feeding it with my own experience, general experience and moment by moment experience, means that what is happening in the therapy room is a creative process because both people are intensely alive at that moment. This is the dialogue that I've had with the steps, in the sense of, what does it mean to me? And I take the continuum that, what is addiction is an extreme, but of a continuum where all of us have had some trauma in a very broad sense, that not trauma in a sense of ER, big catastrophe, major, but something about, if you take as a definition of trauma, dealing with something that was overwhelming at the time it happened, then all of us have unfinished business.
Yes, and it is through trauma, really, or these overwhelming experiences, these difficulties that we don't know how to manage, that we learn how to manage. And so, when we actually learn how to manage them, that's where growth is. And then trauma is a springboard for achieving something that we couldn't have otherwise. But otherwise, there's all these areas that we got stuck into. And so the process of navigating them and mindfully confronting them and proactively dealing with them is what growth is all about. And I think because one of the things as I was looking through the 12 steps, and you do it very nicely in the 4 sort of sections of the book, and then some appendices. And in the first section, you go through a bit more in depth, but there's a neat little appendix, which has just got the principles. And I'm looking through them in that appendix and going, to some degree, these are motherhood and apple pie sort of attitudes and approaches and orientations. And it's a great reminder that, first of all, I love them because they're natural. I must admit, I find some of AA wording and things a little bit sort of not manipulative. Anyway, a bit constructed. Whereas these things, I go, yeah, that I can do that. I feel natural with that. That's a natural thing about me. And then I'm going, but if they're motherhood and apple pie, how come we need to be reminded of them? But that's exactly what you've just described. We have these traumas, we have these things we haven't dealt with, and we get disconnected from our naturalness. And sometimes even I'm playing the piano and I'm not playing terribly well, I go back and I do some scales for a little while. And this is sort of a feeling. Is that the way your clients find it when you're working with them, or the people who've been using the 12 steps talk to you that it resettles them or reconnects them? Is that a thing?
Yeah. It's a way. I think reconnect is a good word. Recentering is a good word. But essentially, the analogy that I like is the GPS. That when you're driving and you suddenly change direction, the GPS has to, for a moment, is disoriented and needs to recalculate the route, and then you're again on a route. Okay, and that concept of the pause and the active pause that's a moment where you get disoriented because you thought you knew where you were going, and suddenly you stop. And when you stop, you realize you don't. But then you kind of get reoriented and you know where you're going. Yeah. And so the steps process that I describe is centered around the practice of that pause, so that time and again, you find yourself recentered, reoriented. And basically, when you are, it feels very basic. It feels very natural. But the moment before, you were not able to access that natural and that basic because you were on a different track.
Do you find that some people, because I was just thinking with that GPS analogy, which is so delightful, that you can be going along, it gets a bit lost, the GPS gets a bit lost, but then sometimes I go, oh, I know where I am, and I sort of put the GPS aside and go off. Do you find that sometimes people, as they're working through the steps, that sometimes they get back into the frame as they're going and not necessarily do this rigid sort of 12-step adherence and then go off? Is this something that happens sometimes?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think that there is one way to do things. I mean, the concept of the reason I articulated it as a process is to say that there is a beauty in seeing that if you are feeling overwhelmed, again, think about it, that the general concept here is this is of help to people, to those clients of ours. Hopefully these are people who go to therapy, but 1 hour of therapy a week is not that lot. People are lost a lot of the time by themselves. So when they feel lost, they have something that's a roadmap, and to say, where am I in this process? Okay.
Yeah, a stabilizing sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So the roadmap tells you, okay, I'm here, but it helps me get grounded.
Yeah. And we've talked about this sort of overall, and it's lovely. But I'm thinking maybe I and some of the people listening, if we could get into one of them. I know when you write it, it's beautiful. You write the step, you do a bit of a description about it, a bit of a discussion, and it's there's some topic points that vary depending on the step, but you give an example and sort of a practical example and a few insights.
In the original 12 steps, the progression, essentially the flavor of it is that you realize that you have been trying to basically play God. And so you surrender to the will of God and you recognize your wrongs and you correct them. And essentially you get redeemed. So I'm a bit doing a caricature. And I think if you talk to people who are long-term practitioners of the 12 step, they would quibble with my description because they don't see it that way. But I think it's the flavor it has because of the language it has. And instead, what I wanted to do is to describe a psychological process. And the psychological process that has to do with understanding why you do what you do as a reaction to overwhelm and essentially trauma. So where you suddenly realize that what you're doing is not working, and you start to face reality, but facing reality does not mean giving up on saying, I need to take care of my life, I need to take charge. It's just realizing that the way you've been going about it has been to try and use your willpower in a way to make the world change. It's something similar to you using willpower to say, I refuse to accept the law of gravity. And if you squeeze your brains hard enough, and if you send waves that are powerful enough, the law of gravity is going to stop working. And you can't do that.
Yeah, good luck with that, yes.
Yeah. So it's about finding a way to actually be able to face reality, understanding that reality to you is very painful because it goes right into your wound, right into your trauma. So how, and again, this is we're using Stephen Porges and all the, the learning that we've had about trauma is about, the reason people do that is not because they're nasty or stupid or, it's because there is something which is essentially fear, threat, and these are physiological reactions to threat that we know a lot more about than people used to. And so what it is how to build a place, an ecosystem of safety and reinforcement and connection where, you only had threat, and you dealt with threat in the very ineffective ways that you figured out because you were overwhelmed. And so it's a step-by-step approach to creating safety, and then in that safety discovering what you're afraid of and taking some time to deconstruct what you're doing in order to identify better ways to do it, to rehearse them, and then practice them. Okay, so this is very different. Again, it's in some ways you could say it's motherhood and apple pie, because all of us, when not in a threat mode, not in an overwhelm mode, of course we know that.
Yeah.
But the question is, we lose track of it when we're in a moment of activation and when it's intense and it's overwhelmed.
Yes. I mean, in the context of some of the language I've been using, combining, engaging with yours, is when we lose our sense of naturalness, we can use our willpower to re-engage, to find, to use pathways, rather than this idea that we've seemed to have in modern society that we can use our willpower to defeat nature. Right. And that's of course, which is just causing us so many just slight disasters. But
I like do you use the word re-engage? And I think that whole concept of mindfulness is engagement.
Yes, isn't it? Yeah.
And so this is that beautiful moment, that virtuous cycle that happens when you're not quite in a mindful mode. You're at the very edge of it, but the pushing a little bit through engagement is not willpower in terms of conquering something, but the intention to actually get more engaged. And the process of being engaged helps you being more mindful, more in that ventral vagal social engagement mode. And so that's the beautiful, virtuous cycle that happens. And that's what this process is about.
Yes, so much. I mean, intention can be viewed as a willpower, as a power of conscious act, but it's also a power of implicit, of non-conscious, of what I call orientation, or what we might call simply as attitude. And I have I've done my due diligence, as you were talking so beautifully there, and grabbed a couple of the steps. Now, we've already actually gone through in what you were talking about. Step one, the orientation, the approach, the area of what you're dealing with is I face reality. I'm not able to control what I do, and this has serious consequences. Meaning, if you do, and as you've discussed, and in step two, we've also managed to talk about that. I understand that I cannot force change through willpower. I need to disentangle my life patiently, which is
so this one I want to like, I love the image of, literally that you have this cord that's all tangled up, and the temptation is you try to pull, you try to do stuff so that it's done quickly, and the more you do, the more tangled up it becomes.
yes.
And so the metaphor for the process is that you're going to have to go step by step, loop by loop. But the same way as you can eventually disentangle a cord, it is possible to remove all of these processes, all of these entanglements in your life, that trauma brought you to.
And isn't it actually, just as you described that, I'm just running through my head, and isn't it that wonderful, albeit testing and challenging and sometimes rather the dark night of the soul, as we talk about it, when you are entangling that thing, there's sort of like, oh my God, oh, look at that, oh, and then suddenly there's a fascination at this terrible thing that you go, but it means this, or it takes me here. And as you're saying, just the disentangling. And then I'm just visualizing myself as, which I'm sure is a part of what this is, by that orientation you had in that second step. I'm visualizing the tangle being less tangled or looser, and I'm feeling better. Just visualizing that as I talk to you.
But that I like when you're talking, your body language has
yes.
that quality, okay? And that quality of, I'm noticing how just your hands are moving more slowly in a more deliberate manner, okay?
So isn't it beautiful the way we speak? Yeah,
exactly.
These things, yeah.
But so, from, the indistinct movement to actually moving slower. So what that more precise movement is that moment where your mind is at more social engagement, mindful engagement mode. So that already you have that fine motor control, okay, which is very different from the brusque thing of just pulling, pushing, impatient. Okay, so just in the talking about it, and the image plays in your mind, it's actually influencing your whole motor system where you are in a more mindful mode, and therefore you have more action on it. And so you're engaged. And
as the therapist, you're observing this. Now, obviously, in this conversation, you're now repeating it to me. And I know my mentor, Ernest Rossi, would often say, and now I will explain what we've just done and ruin it. So I know that you're not suggesting that the therapist sits there and goes through this deep explanation, because, of course, I don't need that explanation, which is I was appreciating, because my hands, but you were able to see the changes in mental processes, the shift from macromotor skills to micromotor skills. You're almost, what you were describing there was a beautiful fMRI of my neurobiological functions. And just on that, coming into those terms, before we go on with one or two of the other actual steps, you do have one chapter which takes a neurobiological orientation, looks at the physiology. That's I think is it's part 3, sort of like the first part's a workbook, the second part's the experiential self perspectives. Then you have this lovely neuroscience perspective, and the fourth chapter or part is a spiritual philosophical aspect. Can you just give you a little bit more, because the science of psychotherapy, we kind of like that, but I think philosophy and spirituality is part of science as well. But a little bit more about that aspect of the body, of the brain, of some of the things that you talk about in the book.
So essentially, it's something that will come as no surprise to people who have been following the work of Stephen Porges and contemporary approaches to trauma, is to really think of what happens to us as part of a continuum with all living or animals who are in nature and facing threat, and that evolving autonomic nervous system that has been the basis of how we interact with threat. And understanding that, it has its own ways of dealing with threat that are understandable within the environment within which we evolved, and much more troubling at times when we are dealing with the environment of civilized society. So being able to see things from that perspective, we're able to actually decode the reactions of the autonomic nervous system as things that have to do with managing threat, and therefore follow them to the extent that they're useful to us, but not when they actually are against our functioning in society. And so one of the things that is very interesting is, for instance, that in a state of nature, we go in stages, from, or not just in nature, all the time, our nervous system goes from ventral vagal to sympathetic to shutdown or collapse. And if you're an animal in nature, or if you're one of our primitive ancestors, that collapse happens in extremely rare situations when it essentially means it's the end. Yeah. And so you conserve energy to survive as long as possible. Mm-hmm. But in contemporary society, in any civilized society, very often there are problems that the parasympathetic activation cannot resolve. You're angry with your boss, you can't punch them or just slam the door and run away. So essentially, what your nervous system gets, the information, is that it's at the end of the rope, whereas it's not. It's just simply what the particular circuit that's involved is not able to resolve it. And ideally, what you would do is take a break, come back, look at it calmly from a distance, and then resolve it in a mindful way, and you'd be fine. But, the nature of our nervous system is that you haven't been able to immediately resolve it, so it escalated to sympathetic. Sympathetic is not able to resolve it. Therefore, you unconsciously conclude that it's impossible, and you're back in that shutdown.
Yes, and it's a barrier, it's a block, and it's many things barrier, that we describe.
And then you get stuck in oscillating between the shutdown and the sympathetic, and you get stuck there, But it's not that the problem is that impossible. It's just the way the nervous system gives you that impression, And so again, if you're able to come back to mindful, then you would see it. Yes. But you get stuck there in the loop because that's how the system functions.
And this thing that we have this not unreasonable idea that the body seeks to not only survive but thrive, as we talk about in positive psychology, but we also must accept the reality that the body will be satisfied with surviving. So it may have all these blocks and barriers, but if you're still eating and putting yourself under shelter and your immune system is still basically able to function, we can biologically implicitly settle for that. And on a genetic level, we'll settle for that. So in order to take these additional processes, these additional steps that we're able to appreciate because of our changed consciousness, our development of mental processes, and we can say, no, I can do better than that. I would like to do better than that. And so all these, this is just such a beautiful frame of it. And you have this lovely conversation with Stephen Porges that you give us a transcript of in the appendix. What was that like? I love talking to Steve, but
the thing, Stephen is wonderful because not just that he's very smart and figured out a lot of things,
Oh, very
but
smart.
he's
Yeah.
actually embodying that attitude in his presence,
Yeah.
in the way he speaks, in the rhythm of his voice, in his smile, in his body language. So it's really very wonderful to see that it's not something that is divorced from experience. And I think it's that makes him that much more convincing, because that is something that is reflected in the way he lives.
Yeah, and I think there's some of you have this in some of the steps, and I'm just thinking, looking at which one that it was about looking at others, and I'm looking. Yes, it's really in step 12 where there's this more of a reflective, more of a pulling the things together. But my life reflects a growing sense of respect and compassion for myself and others. I share this process with others who are struggling, and that's to me that lovely thing. So you've done all this work on inner, and then the 12th step invites you to open up and expand.
And the beauty of it for me is that the two are not contradictory, that
Yes.
we can get so easily trapped in a dichotomy between me, others, selfish, selfless, altruistic, all of these. But the beauty of it is, if not in a place of overwhelm, if not in a place of pressure, the two are actually very, very much complementary and reinforcing each other.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lovely thing, Dan Siegel, the interpersonal neurobiology guy. I know him quite well. We did a lot of things in that area, but he came up with a lovely word, MWE. MWE,
right?
The me, we, and there's been there's been some beautiful expressions of that through history and various philosophers. That's just a nice, neat one. Now, I think there's we're sort of coming a little bit to the end of our session together. We do find that around 35-40 minutes, everybody finishes their run or something and they turn us off. But I don't want to, because there's so much more that I really wanted to talk about. I think I'd like to do a little bit more, just because you do have that chapter on the part on spirituality. And there's a couple of things that I really like, just little quotes I noted down. You said, introducing the section, and then saying it's not necessarily that you're a card-carrying member of a particular religion or philosophy. And then a few lines further on, you say, let your curiosity guide you. So you've taken a very broad humanistic, actually, this is the question. It seems as though you've taken this broad humanistic view of spirituality rather than these isolated, regulated forms. What was the process there?
I have trouble with the concept of spirituality as something that is essentially spirits or some tradition. I think that, when any tradition that is, that was powerful, was very alive, it had tremendous meaning to people, and it was a way of engaging with reality. It was not some kind of a quaint sub-practice. It was about spirituality, but it was about how to have control over life, how to have understanding over life. And then, it gets split because we have other means of having understanding, meaning, and some degree of action over life with science. And so spirituality becomes something secondary. But I have a much broader concept of spirituality, which is how we understand how we fit in the world. and through whatever means necessary. And some of it is what science tells us, and some of it is what experience tells us, and some of it is, what maybe traditions have to tell us in terms of concepts that help us, better engage with the world. But I think of it more as a sense of understanding of how we fit.
Mm. And it just sort of, I could hear the two words, this, as you say, this understanding over life as different from understanding of, perhaps is, what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And that same thing that perhaps that was a little bit of the feeling that I got with the AA 12 steps, was that there was a defeat of your addiction or of your issues, rather than a re-engagement with those things that were the opposite, that were the not addictions, the not disconnections, the not traumas.
And I think that there are lots of people in AA who would see it that way, but I think the language, unfortunately, encourages people to think of it in terms of defeat and submission. And
yes, just the language of it. That's quite right. I have talked to many AAs.
Yeah. And so what I really wanted to convey is the sense, I think you beautifully had it with that sense of re-engagement in life, that there is something about overwhelm, and overwhelm means defeat. And so from that place of defeat, there is a logical and necessity to retrench. Just the same way as, say, in trauma treatment, you try and move away from the heart of what the trauma is in order to find the right distance to deal with it. And then as you progressively regain your footing, you can then engage more with it and be able to deal with it. So there's that sense of it's not a defeat and just you assuming that actually you're now inferior or you're humiliated and come down, but is finding a better way to deal with the world.
Yes, it's that wondrous thing. I must admit, I've been listening to the replay, the Beatles, the Get Back. That's on Netflix or something, and this extraordinary thing of listening to Paul McCartney and John Lennon, but Paul McCartney particularly, of course, because he's mostly interviewed, because poor old John Lennon's left us. But here are these guys with these incredible capacities and possibilities and things in their head, and extraordinary. And he said, we go along and someone teaches us a new chord, and we go, oh, that's great. And then, so this information coming from out to then going within, and then connecting with all that individual possibility and capacity, and who knows what's going to come out. Now, we're not all obviously going to be, the McCartney songwriters or the whatever it is. But I guess what I started off at the very beginning saying, I actually really miss having my co-host Matt here, because there's something about that we feed each other.
Yeah.
And these 12 steps enable, give a working platform for the therapist and the clients interfeeding of each other. It's very nice. It's very, very nice. Now, we'll certainly give links back to your websites and show places where people can get a hold of this, and so they can incorporate it. And I can see it as a wonderful tool that the therapist and the client can engage in together. And I can see from what you're talking, that's what it's like.
Or actually, sometimes it's something that the client does on their own. And just maybe refers to the therapist, that, it's like it becomes their own process. But if the therapist has a language or a roadmap to follow them when they're on their own.
So the therapist can introduce the material and then allow the client to find their own experience with it. So it's got a multiple level set of levels in which it can be which it can be, and the word that we've become delighted with, engaged. I mean, although it is a great word.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, is there anything I've missed, or if not, is there just sort of a closing sentiment, something to leave everybody with at this stage?
I think the one thing that I would want to focus on is the centrality of the pause, as thought of as an active pause. And that is, very much similar to what we talked about the GPS, that sense of moment by moment, and, that there is always the possibility of renegotiating the relationship with the world through that pause.
Yeah.
And I think of the 12 steps as something that's built around that, that's describing what happens moment by moment and what happens over time.
Okay, that's really something for us to really enjoy, in the specific nature of this pragmatic approach with particular details, but also I think just as a philosophical sense of what we're trying to do with ourselves and with each other. I think it's a beautiful way to conclude the program. So for now, Serge Prengel, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and your beauty and your gentleness and your kindness as well. And we look forward to people taking a great interest in this wonderful work you're doing. Thanks for being our guest.
Richard, I really enjoyed your presence, your conversation, and your stimulating ideas.
Beautiful. Well, everybody, it's bye for now.